Hello everyone. Is my voice audible, guys? In last session, we have explored about the scopes, right? Scopes in JavaScript. And we have seen what is global scope, function scope. And already we have explored module scope also. Module scope is nothing but your import and export concept. And we have seen the scope statements. Okay, like what is the difference between let, var, and const. This is what we have explored in the last session. In today's session, we will start with something called object-oriented programming. So anybody knows what is object-oriented programming? So if someone asks you what is object-oriented programming, what will be your answer? What is object-oriented programming? Or in short, we can call this as a OOPS. So what is object-oriented programming? Anybody? If someone asks you what is object-oriented programming, what will be your answer? Program which deals with these objects. Nice. Anything else? Any other answer? So I got one answer, like program which deals with the objects. Okay. Any other answer, guys? Whatever you guys can express. You might have learned about object-oriented programming in different languages, right? You might have learned about Java language or C# or Python. There you might have explored about this object-oriented programming. Okay. So if someone asks you what is object-oriented programming, you have to say it is one of the programming paradigm. So what is object-oriented programming? It is one of the programming paradigm. Okay. What do you mean by paradigm? Okay. Paradigm. Basically, paradigm is nothing but style of programming. Paradigm is nothing but style or pattern of programming. Style or pattern of programming. So there are different style or pattern of programming. So JavaScript follows functional programming. Something called functional programming. Okay, your C++ follows your procedural programming. In the same way, we have something called object-oriented programming also. All these are different style of doing the programming. Okay, so object-oriented programming is one of the programming paradigm, one of the style to write the programs, one of the pattern to write the programs. Now, this style of or pattern of the programming is nothing but it deals with everything as an object. So whenever you are using object-oriented programming, here everything we will consider like an object. So in OOPS, everything is considered as an object. Everything is considered object. For example, let's suppose I want to store one product information. Suppose I have nearly 10 products. If I have 10 products And if I want to store, or if I want to do some kind of operation on these 10 products, then what object-oriented programming is suggesting? You create 10 objects. For each product, you create one object. For each product, you create one object, and in that object, you store the information. You can store your product name. You can store your brand. You can store your price. Whatever you want, you can store everything in the object. Everything you have to consider like object. This is what the intention of this object-oriented programming. Suppose if you want to store some users information, then all those information should be in the object format. All those information should be in the object format. Okay, but if you have like this 10 products, now creating like this 10 manual objects, manually if you want to create like this 10 objects, it's a very hectic task. Object-oriented programming is telling that everything you see like an object. If you want to do anything, just create the object. Just create the object. In that object, you can store your data. You can store your functions to do some kind of operations. Now, creating like this manually each and every object is very hectic task. Is a very hectic task. So in that case, what we can do? We can assign some of the object creation to one developer and some other object creation to some other developer. In that case, what happens if developer doesn't have proper instructions? Like if developers or if the persons don't know exactly what properties they need to add in the objects, then there are a lot of chances that inconsistency of data might occur. Like in one object, you might find some set of properties. In another object, you might find some other set of properties. So there are two problems. The first problem, creating the object manually, is a very hectic task. Suppose if you have 1,000 products. Now for 1,000 products, creating manually the object is very hectic task. And let's assume that in each object, I want to store nearly 10 properties. Then manually adding 10 properties in each and every object is very hectic task. Creating 1,000 objects and each object having 10 properties is very, very hectic task if you go with the manual process. So to overcome this problem, to overcome this inconsistency problem and the creation of this object problem, what object-oriented programming is saying, first you create one plan. You first create one plan. You decide in your object how many properties you should have. In your object, how many functions you want to add, so that you can perform some kind of operation. You first create one plan, and technically that plan we are going to call as a class. Once your plan is ready, based on that plan, you create your objects. You create your objects. And to create these objects, no need to do manual things. No need to create this object manually. We have some technique to create the object automatically based on our plan. It means your objects will be created now based on your plan. Based on your plan. In this plan, what you need to do? In this plan, you need to decide how many properties you want, how many functions you want. All those things you have to decide inside your plan. So technically that plan we are going to call as a class, and object we are going to call as an instance. We are going to call as an instance. Instance of a class. So how to create this plan? How to create this class? So to create the class, we have to follow certain syntax in JavaScript. The syntax is, you have to start with the class keyword. Now this is the class keyword which has some reserved meaning. Space. You have to give some name to your plan. You have to give some name to your class, nothing but your class name. Then open curly brace and close curly brace. Now inside this curly brace, you can decide what properties you want to define. Properties are nothing but, here it's like a variables only. But technically we call this as a properties. variables without scope statement. We should not use here scope statements. Directly we have to decide define the properties. And on those properties, if you want to do some kind of actions, then we can define something called methods. Methods are nothing but they are like functions. They are like functions. So these methods and properties we have to define inside the class. So this is how we are going to decide like exactly how our object should be created and what properties and methods it should contain. Let's suppose I want to store one product information. Now you decide related to this product, what should be the information. So for that, what I will do, I will simply create one class here. Something like product. Now I will decide that in my product object, I should have the product name. So I will create one property called product name. I should have the brand name. So I will have a property brand name. I should have a price. I should have a something like rating. Some rating. So I want this many information about my product. So as of now, I'm just defining the properties. I'm not defining any methods. I'm just defining the properties. So I'm expecting that whenever I create any product object, in that product object, these 4 properties should be available. These 4 properties should be available. Now, once we have a plan, based on that plan, we can create any number of objects. Each object is going to represent some kind of product. Each object is going to represent some kind of product. So this is how we create the class in our JavaScript. So practically how we will create? Simply we will go and create one JavaScript file. Here if I want to create a class, simply use class keyword, space, give some name. So I'm just giving here products. Open curly brace, close curly brace. Now your class name should start with the capital letters. Okay, but it is just recommended. It's not mandatory. If I start with the small letter, still it works. Still it works. But it is just recommended to start your class name with the capital letter. So in your JavaScript, you don't have any restrictions that it should start with the capital letter only. You can define your class name with lower cases also. But it is just recommended that your class name should start with the capital letter. Now, this is the product. This is my class. Inside this, we can define properties. Now, properties are nothing but they are like variables only. The difference between properties and variables is properties you have to define inside this class block. Properties we have to define inside the class block. And while defining the properties or while declaring the properties, you should not use scope statements. Like this, I should not use var. Var something like brand name. So this is not valid in your class. So you should not use this var, let or const. Just remove it. So this is my property brand name. Like this, I can have any number of properties. Like I can have model name. I can have price. I can have rating. Like this, I can have any number of properties. Now here what I did, I just created the properties. If you want, you can initialize some default data here. So I'm saying here brand Apple. Model name, I'm saying here something like MacBook Pro. Price, I'm saying nearly 2,30,000. Rating, I'm just giving here something like 4.5. So what I did, I created one class, I created one plan, and I have decided like in whatever objects I will create in that object, these 4 properties should be available. Now, how to create object? How to create object? Now we have created our plan. Now, based on this plan, we need to create object. So to create the object, we have to take the help of 2 things. The first thing, we have to take the help of one special operator called new. And then we have to call here one special method, one special function called constructor. We have to use constructor. Now, what is that constructor? I will explain you in some time. As of now, you just understand constructor is one special method. It is one special method. Now, why we are going to call it as a special method? Because the purpose of constructor is already defined. In that method, what kind of logic should be available? That is already predefined. That is the reason we call constructor as a special method. So we have to use this both the things, new operator and constructor, to create the object. Now, what this new operator and constructor will do? It will create one object. In that, it will add all the properties that you have defined in the class, and it will return you the reference of that object. It will return you the reference of that object. So here we have to use new operator, then constructor. Now, what will be the name of constructor? The name of constructor will be always the name of your class. Whatever name of your class you have given, same name you will have to your constructor. So you have to call constructor with your class name. Now, constructor is a methods. Methods are nothing but basically like functions. So we have to call like this. Now, this line will create the instance of this class. Nothing but it will create one object for this class. And it will return that object. Now, if it is returning that object, now you can cache that object in one variable. So outside the class, you can use your var, nothing but scope statements now. So here I am saying like product one. Now, inside this product one, there is one object which contains these four properties. Now, here if I do console.log of product one, now let's see what it will print. If I go back here and if I execute node class, now see, it is printing one object. Okay, one special object it is printing, in which you have all the four properties. This is the one more way of creating the object. New products. It created one object. Like this, I can create any number of objects. I can create one more object here like this. And I can change the reference. I can do here one more console.log of product 2. Now, if I go back here, I execute it. Now, see, I got here 2 objects. So, by default, same data is stored in both the object. If you want, you can change the data in second object. So, here the point what we have to understand is how to create class, how to add properties, and how to create objects. So this is how we create class and objects in JavaScript. Little bit syntax is different compared to your Java language. In your Java language, you will have something like main method. In that main method, you can create all the instances. But here we don't have any main method. Everything we have to create outside the class. Now, inside this class, I can have methods also. Like I can say one display method. So this method, in this method, I want to print the values of all my properties. So inside your class, if you want to access any properties or methods, then you have to use one special keyword called this. You have to use some special keyword called this. For example, suppose inside this method, I want to use this property. I cannot use like this directly. Brand name. I should not use like this directly brand name. So if you want to access any property or any method inside your class, then you have to access using this keyword. You have to say this dot your property name or method name. So here this dot brand name, comma, this dot model name, comma, this dot price, comma, this dot rating. Now here I can have one more method, something like change price. So I want to create one method to change the price. And whenever this method is called, I want to pass one argument. So here I can catch those argument using a parameter, something called new price. Now this new price I want to allocate to my price property. So here I will say this dot price equals to new price. So here what I did, I created two methods. One method will display all the details of my properties. One method is used to change the price value. So whenever I want to change the price, I can call this method. I can pass my new price. Now again, if I just try to execute it. Now see, in the object, it is printing only properties. But in this object, the space for this methods also stored. Suppose if you want to access these methods outside your class, then you have to take the help of this objects only. For example, if I say product one dot, if I call display, this display method will be called. So outside the class, if you want to access these methods, then you have to access using its reference object name dot display. Here also I can do something like this. Product two dot, I will say brand name, and I will change brand name to something like Samsung. So if you want to access your properties or methods outside the class, then what you need to do, you have to access using their instance name, nothing but using their object name. Now here I can just change all the details for my product two. Product two dot model name, I will change it to something like Galaxy. Something like S23 Ultra. Price, product two dot price, I will change it to something like 1,25,000. Product two dot rating, I will change it to something like 4.3. So basically what we did, we created one class here. And based on this class, we created two objects. This is your product one. Okay, this is your product two. So by default, in this both the object, we had same data. So this is your product two. This is your product one. So by default, in product one and product two, we had same data. Now what we did, we have just modified the data of this product two. Modified the data of product two. That's it. Now if you go back here, now see here, I will do one thing. Before modifying, I will print here product two dot display. And after modifying, again I will print product two dot display. So what it will print, let's try that. So here, in between this both, I will just add something like this, console.log, and I will add this content, so that we will come to know, like before updating, what was the data inside product two, and after updating, what is the data in the product two. Now if I go back here and if I execute, now see, before updating in the product two, this was the data. After updating product two, now my new data is this one. So the point what you have to remember, if you want to access any properties or methods outside the class, then you can access using these instances. If you want to access any properties or methods inside the class, then we have to use this keyword. Now see, whenever I call product1.display. Whenever I call product1.display, so what it will do, it will call this display function. In this case, this is going to point to your product one. Here, this is pointing to your product one. This is pointing to your product one. Now, whenever I call product2.display, product2.display, in that case, this will point to my product2. So internally, class is changing the reference of this. Sometimes this is pointing to product one. Sometimes this is pointing to product two. Sometimes this will point to product three. Like this, you can have 100 products. And each and every time, the reference of this is changing. In last session, we have seen, right, how to change the reference of this. How JavaScript is changing the reference of this keyword. So this is pointing sometimes to product one, sometimes it is pointing to product like that. So in our class, we can have any number of properties. We can have any number of methods like this. Any number of methods like this. All the methods outside the class, we have to access using object. Inside the class, we have to access using our this keyword. For example, after changing the price, I want to call this display method. I can say this dot display here, like this. That's it. So now if I want, I can change my price of my product one. For example, product one dot change price. And here I'm adding some price like 5 lakhs. Now what this change price will do? It will change the price and again it will call internally display function. Now see, here price got changed. Price got changed. Price was 2,30,000, but now the price is 5 lakh. Price is 5 lakh. Okay. So this is how we create the class. This is how we create the instances. This is how we access the properties of our class outside, like inside the class using this, outside the class using our instance names or object name. You can call this as an instance or you can call this as a objects. Now, why do we call, technically we should call instance, but they are in the object format. So people prefers to call this as objects. Now, there is one problem. The problem is, suppose if I am creating like this, multiple instances. Suppose I am creating totally 4 instances. So in all the 4 instances, by default, that what data will be added? This data will be added. By default, in every instance, brand name will be Apple, model name will be MacBook Pro. So I don't want like that. I want in my each instance, by default, there should be some unique data. If I am creating 4 instances, in 4 instances, by default, I want some unique data. So how to add unique data in all the instances while creating it? This is where your constructor comes into picture. Now, what is constructor? Now, constructor is a special method in the class. Constructor purpose is to initialize the properties of the class. What is the purpose of constructor? Why do we create constructor? Constructor is all about initializing default data to your properties. It is used to initialize the properties of the class. So in your object-oriented programming, it is not recommended to initialize your properties directly like this. We should not initialize the properties directly like this. If you initialize the properties directly like this, the problem is every instance by default will get the same data. So to overcome this problem, what they are suggesting, you create one special method called constructor, and in that special method called constructor, you initialize your properties, because constructor is called each and every time whenever object is creating. So at that time only we can pass some default data, some unique data to each and every instance. And in our JavaScript, while defining the constructor, constructor name should be constructor only. And while calling the constructor, we should use constructor name as a class name. While defining the constructor name should be constructor, but while calling that constructor, we have to use class name. Now this is little bit weird in JavaScript, but yes, we have to follow this rule. Suppose if I just create one new file here, constructor. Now here, if you want to create a class, just create a class like this, user. Now I am just defining the properties, username, here gender, here email. I have three properties. Now I am not initializing any data. I just created the properties. Now I want to define one constructor here. How to define the constructor? Simply pass your constructor here. That's it. So while defining, the name of your constructor should be constructor only. Constructor only. Constructor, this is how we define the constructor in JavaScript. Now this constructor can take any number of parameters. So I'm just taking here name, comma, gender, comma, email. Now inside this constructor, we have to write the logic. Inside this constructor, what logic we have to write means we have to initialize this properties. That's it. Apart from that, you should not write any other logics. We should not write any other logics inside the constructor. Now here, simply we have to say this dot username equals to name. This dot gender equals to gender. This dot email equals to email. So we have created the constructor. Now you can define any number of methods here. I can simply say display, or whatever methods you want, you can define. And here simply I'm just trying to print all the properties. So this dot username, comma, this dot gender, comma, this dot email. Now, whenever I am creating the object for this class, so we have to use new. Now we have to call the constructor here. Now while calling the constructor, we have to use class name. What is our class name? User. So this is like user. Now this is constructor call. This is constructor call. Now our constructor is taking how many parameters? 3 parameters. So you have to pass here 3 arguments. So I am passing here something like Raj. Then I have here something like gender male. And here email ID is something like raj@gmail.com. Now one object will be created with these 3 properties, and in that 3 properties, this data will be added. So here I am saying like var user1. Now like this, I can create any number of users. I can create user2, I can create user3. Now while creating user2, I can pass here some unique data. So I can say here something like Sneha, gender as female. Here Sneha@gmail.com. Here something like Rahul, male, here Rahul. Now, how many objects will you create? 3 objects are created. And in all the 3 objects, we have unique data. Now, suppose if I say here, user1 dot display, user2 dot display, user3 dot display. And if I execute this part, node constructor. Now see, Raj, Sneha, Rahul. Now we have 3 instances. In all these 3 instances, by default, we have different data. How we got that different data? Because of this constructor. Because of this constructor. So using constructor, if you want to show same data, then don't use parameters. Directly hard code your values. Directly assign the values here. In that case, for each and every instance, same data will be created by default. So by default, if you want to add same data in all the instances, then no need to add these parameters. Directly you can assign the data here. Suppose I have here property called something like CT. Now for this CT, I want to keep common city for each and every user. So I will directly hard code here, something like Pune. Now in this case, what happens? In each and every instance, it should print city value as Pune only. Maybe here I will add city. Now here I got Pune, here I got Pune, here I got Pune. So the purpose of constructor is to initialize your properties. So using constructor, you can initialize different values for each and every object. And using constructor, you can initialize common values for each and every object. So this is your constructor. So we know how to create class, how to define properties, how to define constructor, and the purpose of constructor. We know the purpose of constructor. Apart from this, there are certain concepts which are not supported in your JavaScript when it comes to object-oriented programming. Concepts like multiple inheritance is not at all supported in your JavaScript. We don't have any concept of interface in JavaScript. We don't have any concept of abstract classes in JavaScript. We don't have any classes of access modifiers. We have access modifiers, but we have only 2 access modifiers. One is public and one is private. We don't have anything like a protected access modifier in JavaScript. We have public and we have private. So you don't have any concept like multiple inheritance, interface, abstract class, abstract methods, and you don't have the concept of polymorphism with method overloading. We don't have any concept of method overloading in JavaScript. In JavaScript, polymorphism is supported using method overriding. Using method overriding, polymorphism is supported. Okay, all these concepts are not supported. That is the only reason why your TypeScript came into picture. Now, why Angular uses TypeScript? Because Angular wants to support all these concepts. That is the reason your TypeScript comes into picture. So TypeScript supports all these concepts. But in JavaScript, all these concepts are not supported. Yeah, we have defined the methods, right? So we have to define the methods. If you don't define the methods, then there is no way to define the methods. So inside class, you can define the methods, but you should initialize the properties only inside the constructor. This is why constructor came into picture. Just pass your object, assign the object, you will create nested object. Okay, so this is how we create the class constructor. Now, there are some topics like inheritance, polymorphism, static, non-static properties, all that I have explained in video. So I just created the video. So I will upload that video link here itself. Okay. Here I will add that video link. So you can watch that video. In that I have explained you the inheritance concept. I have explained the polymorphism with overriding. I have explained the static and non-static properties and methods. So I will upload, like I will just add that video link here. So whatever videos I will provide you guys, I will add those videos links here itself. So you can find those videos from that link. If you want, you guys can download those videos and you can watch those videos. So remaining topics of your object-oriented programming, I have explained in that videos, so you can watch it. So in that videos, I will just add here what are the topics I will explain. Object-oriented programming topics I will explain, like inheritance. You will have static, non-static. You have polymorphism with overriding. Okay, here I will add public and private properties and methods, how to define. String and string methods. Okay, string and string methods I will define here. Anyways, operator was not in your syllabus, but still I will explain you here. Bitwise operator and assignment operators. So all this content you will find in the videos. That video link I will add here. I will add that video link here. You guys can watch that video from here, this file, video.txt. Okay, now here. So this object-oriented programming, we won't use much in React, especially in React. So that's why it is not much supported in JavaScript. Now, the most important topic you have to understand is promise. Promises in the JavaScript. Promises in the JavaScript. So anybody knows what are promises in JavaScript? Just watch the syllabus and just check whether you have added that operator topics or not. If you find operator topics, I will add that video there. So if you simply ask when you will add, then I have to stick with syllabus, right? If whatever syllabus is there, I will explain only those things. First, be perfect with the topics, whatever I am explaining. Okay, everything will come to your hands whenever that time comes. Yeah. Anybody knows what is promises in the JavaScript? Anybody heard about promise concept in the JavaScript? So promise is a special object in the JavaScript, which contains success information or error information. or sometimes we call this error information as a failure information. What is promise in JavaScript means? Promise is a special object in JavaScript. It is a special object in JavaScript. Remember, I am using the word special object, which contains something called success information, or we can call this as a error or failure information. Error or failure information. Now, what do you mean by this error and success information? We will try to understand that. Okay. So as of now, you have to remember what is promise. Promise is a special object. If it is an object, if it is a special object, then there is a special way to create this object. So how to create promise object? How to create promise object? So promise object is created using a special constructor called promise constructor. Promise object is created using a special constructor called promise constructor. It is a promise constructor. So how to create a promise object means using one special constructor called promise constructor. Now this is predefined constructor. So you need not to create any class for that particular constructor. Already the class is created. Already the constructor is also available to us. So we have to just use this constructor and we have to use new operator to create the promise object. So let me show you how to create the promise object. Now let's suppose I want to create here promise object. Simply what I will do, I will use new operator and I will use one predefined constructor called promise. That's it. Now if I call this constructor and if I use new operator, it will return me one promise object. So I can catch that in one variable. Like I can say promise object. Now what this promise object should have? This promise object should have some data. Should have some data. So if it has a special way to create object, then it has some special way to add the data inside the object. It means there is a special way to add data inside the object, inside the promise object. So we cannot add manually the data directly inside the promise object. We have some special way to add the data inside the promise object. Now, what type of data we can add inside this promise object? Inside this promise object, we can add the data, something called success, or we can add the data, something called error. We can add error data or success data. Now, which type of data we are going to call as a success data? Which type of data we are going to call as a error data? That we have to understand. So here, the first point you should know how to create a promise object. So promise object is created using a special constructor called promise and using a special operator called new operator. Now this promise constructor will take one argument, and that one argument is one callback function. It is one callback function. So promise constructor will take one argument, and one argument is, and that argument is one callback function. Now this callback function will take two parameters. It will take two parameters. So you can give whatever names you want to give to those parameters. Whatever names you want to give, you can give to those parameters. But generally, we will give the parameter names as resolve and reject. Now, why we prefer to give resolve and reject as a parameters names? Because inside these two parameters, by default, two predefined functions will be stored. And those two predefined functions are resolve and reject. So what is resolve and reject? Resolve and reject are two predefined functions in JavaScript. Resolve and reject are two predefined functions in the JavaScript. And purpose of these functions is to add data inside the promise object. So what is the purpose of these two predefined functions? Using these two predefined functions, we can add the data inside the promise object. So inside this promise object, if you want to add some data, then we have to take the help of two predefined functions called resolve and reject. So resolve function always kept in the first parameter, and in second parameter always reject function is kept. Now that resolve and reject function you can call here. Suppose here I am calling resolve like this. Now resolve is a predefined function, so I can call like this. So that function is kept in first parameter. So I can call this parameter like a function. Now here I can pass whatever data I want to pass. Suppose I am passing here Kabir. Now this Kabir data will be stored inside this promise object. Who will store this? Resolve will store internally. So whenever you call constructor, internally this callback function is called. And this callback function internally it will call resolve. Inside the resolve, whatever you will pass, that data will be added inside this promise object. In the same way, you can call reject also. You can call this reject function also. And here also you can pass some data. You can pass some data. Whatever data you want, you can pass. You can pass string, you can pass number, you can pass array, you can pass object. Whatever you want, you can pass inside this resolve and reject. Whatever you will pass inside resolve and reject, those data will be added in the promise object. So inside this callback function, we have to call resolve or reject. At a time, we have to call any one function. We cannot call both the functions. We have to call any one function. It means inside this promise object, you can add the data either using resolve or either using reject. That you have to decide. Inside my promise object, data should come from resolve or reject. If you are adding the data inside the promise object using resolve, then that data we call as a success data or a success response. If you add data inside your promise object using reject function, then such type of data we are going to call as a failure response, or we can call that as an error data. We can call that as an error data. So what do you mean by success data? The data in the promise object, if you store using resolve function, then that data we call as a success information or success data you can call. Inside the promise object, if you store the data using reject function, then that data we can call as a error information or failure information, or you can call it as a error data. So different people will use different terms. That is the reason I have told you what is promise. Promise is one object in which we can store two types of data, success data and failure data. Which data we call as a success inside promise object if you are storing the data using your resolve function. Which data we call as a error data inside the promise object if we are storing the data using reject, using the reject. Now see, here I am saying reject Sagar. Now here I will just console.log of promise object. Now if I go back here, now if I execute it, node promise. Now see, this is the promise object which is printing one object here. And in that object, we have the data called Sagar. Now it has some special way of storing the data. Now in the same way, if I try to call this resolve, and in that if I pass some data, like suppose I am passing Kabir. Again, if I try to execute it. Now see, here it is printing Kabir inside that object. So using this resolve and reject, what we can do, we can add the data inside the promise. Suppose I am not calling resolve or reject. It means inside my promise object, I don't have any data. It's an empty data. So it's a empty. It is saying that pending. I don't have any data inside this object. It's a pending. Still, it is a pending. So this promise object has 3 states. Promise object has 3 states. The first we are going to call as a pending state. Whenever someone says my promise object is in the pending state, it means your promise object is created, but in that object you don't have any data. So empty data, empty object, empty promise object. This is what you have to assume. Whenever you receive any promise state as a pending state, it means promise object is created, but it doesn't have any data. Second, you have fulfilled state. Fulfilled state means inside your object you have data, but that data has been stored using resolve function. Data stored in the promise object using resolve function. Third one is rejected state. Rejected state means inside your promise object, data stored in the promise object using reject function. Using reject function. Using reject function. Using reject function. Okay, so here you can use resolve. I can pass one object also. I can say here status true. I will say data, one array. In that I can have object like this. Like this I can pass one object also. Or I can have reject here. In that reject also I can pass one object. I can say status false. Whatever data I want I can pass. Here I will say data, some error occurred. Like this I can pass whatever data I want. But at a time you cannot call this both the functions. You have to call any one. Either resolve, either reject. Now who will decide whether resolve should call or reject should call? The people who create promise. The person who is creating the promise object, he need to decide whether he need to add the data inside the promise object using resolve or using reject. Now as a front-end developer, we never create promise object. We never get a chance to create a promise object. It means this part we will never do. So as a front-end developer, we will never create a promise object. As a front-end developer, our work is to consume the promise object. Consume is nothing but access the data of promise object. How to consume? Or I can use the word access the promise object data. Now let's suppose someone given us promise object. and in that promise object, there is some data. Now I want to utilize that data. Let's assume that you created front-end application and there is some back-end application and there is some database. Now let's assume that in your front-end application, you created one table here. Now inside this table, you want to display some data, but the data is present in the database. There are so much data in the database. Now you want this data so that you can display inside the table. So what you will do as a front-end application, as a front-end developer, you can just request that data to server. You can ask this backend developers or backend application, I want the data which is in the database. Now this backend people will receive your data. They will connect with the database. They will do some operation. They will access the data. They will send that data back to you. Now as a client, you will receive the data in the promise object. If you are using functions like fetch or libraries like Axios, you will receive the data in the promise object. Now, why you will receive the data in promise object? Now, it is not mandatory that whenever you request the data, you will get exactly what data you are requesting. Is it mandatory that each and every time your server will send the same data, that data you are requesting? Sometimes there might be some problem at server, maybe some problem at database, due to which they fail to give you the data. If they fail to give you the data, in that case, they will give you some error message. They will give some error data to you. They will say, okay, there was some problem at database due to which I was not able to fetch the data. So they will send some response. As a response, you can get the data what you have requested. That is one scenario. Another scenario is you might get the data which you are not expecting. For example, it can be error data. So sometimes in this promise object, you will get success data. Success data means data which you are expecting. Error data means data which you were not expecting. You got data, you got some error message. They explained you what the error you got at the server side or at database level. But you were not expecting that data. You were expecting this data. So the data which you are not expecting, it is called error data. Data which you were expecting, it is called success data. So as a client developer, you will get access to the promise object or you will get the promise object. So 99% you will be the consumer of the promise object. We never get a chance to create promise object. So we are like a consumer of the promise object, or we need to, once we receive the promise object, we need to know how to access the data from the promise object. Now, how to access the data from promise object? It is not that direct way. So to access the data from promise object, we have to take the help of then function, then and catch function, or else you can take the help of async await. Async await. So there are two ways to handle the promise object, or there are two ways to consume the data of promise object. First way is using then and catch function. Second way is using async await. Using async await. Using async await, we can consume the promise object. We can handle the promise object. Using then and catch also, we can consume or access the promise object data. So let's see how then and catch will work. So syntax is very easy. Your promise object, on this promise object, you have to call then function. On that then function, we can call one catch function. This is the syntax. Promise object dot then dot catch. This then will take one callback function. Then will take one callback function. Your catch will also take one callback function. Now, inside your promise object, inside your promise object, if the data has been stored using resolve function, inside this promise object, whoever created this promise object, inside this promise object, if the data is stored using resolve function, or in this promise object, if you have success data, then this part will get executed. Then will get executed. And whatever data you have in the promise object, that data will be passed, that data will be stored in the first parameter of this callback function. First parameter of this callback function. Suppose inside your promise object, if you have failure data, inside your promise object, if the data has been stored using reject function, then this catch will get executed. Catch function will get called. And whatever data you have in the promise, that data will be stored, or that data will be copied inside the first parameter of this callback function. It means between then and catch, any one function will get executed. Either then will execute, either catch will execute. And when then will execute, that depends upon promise object. When catch will execute, that depends upon promise object. Inside your promise object, if you have success data, then will execute, and whatever data you have in promise object, that data will be copied in the first parameter of this callback function. Inside your promise object, if you have failure data, or if you store the data using reject function, then catch will be called. And whatever data you have in the promise object, that data will be copied in the first parameter of this callback function. And this callback function will be called. So this is how we consume the promise object data using then and catch. So let's try practically. Now here, this is my promise object. Inside this promise object, I am storing this data, and I am storing the data using resolve function. Now I want the access of that data. So what I will do, I will take my promise object, I will call my then function, I will call my catch function, then catch. Now then we'll take one callback function, catch will also take one callback function. This callback function will take one parameter. I will say here success data. This also will take one parameter, error data. Now inside this promise object, which type of data we have stored? Inside this promise object, which type of data we have stored? We have stored success data. It means then will be called. And then internally then will call this callback function. And whatever data you have in the promise object, that data will be copied inside this parameter. Now here we can just do console.log. And here I can say something like then, comma, I can print this success data. I'm just writing here then, just to make understand that this callback function got executed. Here also what I will do, I will write console.log. Here I will write something like catch, comma, error data. If catch got executes, it means this console got executed. Now let's see here. If I say node promise, now see here we got then. And in that then, see it is printing entire object. It is printing entire object that we were passing. So here we were passing this entire object, right? Now it is printing as it is that entire object. Now once you have this object, once you have the data, then you can write here whatever logic you want. You can write whatever logic you want to write, and you can just do some kind of operation. Suppose here I am commenting this resolve. I am uncommenting this reject. Now let's suppose I am storing the data inside my promise object using reject. Then let's see what happens. Now see, catch got executed. Catch got executed and see it is printing the data. As it is, we got the access to data. We got here access to data. We got the access to data. So if you are storing the data inside promise object using reject, then catch will get executed. If you are storing the data in promise object using resolve, then your then will get executed. So once you get error data, whatever you want to do, you write logic here. Once you get success data, whatever you want to do, write that logic here. Write that logic here. So here I just made you guys understand how to create promise object, how to consume or access the promise object data. Promise object data. Yeah, I will ask manage. I think it is not recorded, but they will upload. Okay, don't worry. So it is not started in YouTube, but video is getting recorded. So I hope they will add in the YouTube. Okay. So this is very, very important, guys. If you want, you guys go and watch promise concept video in any YouTube channel. You won't understand it. I have explained you practically and clearly what is promise object. Whatever I have explained you, everything I have shown you practically. It is not like I'm just explaining you the theory part. I told you what is resolve and reject. Those are two predefined functions. Using resolve, we can store any type of data. Any type of data you can store. Okay, for example, I don't want to add object. Let's assume that I want to add only one string. I'm adding just string like Kabir. Now in your console, see, only Kabir will print. Now if I go back here, if I say node promise, only Kabir will print. Okay, here we are printing then also, right? So this then, here it is printing. Then we have success data. In success data, it is printing Kabir. Now suppose using reject. Now using reject also, I can send only one string also. If I want, I can send only one string. I can say something like error due to server crash. Some message I am sending. Now if I try to execute it. Now see, I got catch and I got that data as it is, error due to server crash. So this catch as it is printing, then we got this error data. So as a client side developer or a front end developer, our work is to do like this. Our work will be always consuming the promise object. So there are some libraries like Axios. There is a predefined function called fetch, which will create promise object for us. So you need not to worry how they are creating. They will just tell that, okay, I am giving you promise object. Now, once we have that promise object, we have to handle it. We have to consume it. Because whenever fetch, someone is giving us promise object. Now we don't know, right? In that promise object, we have success data or we have error data. So that is the reason we have to manage both these scenarios. So to manage both these scenarios, you have two predefined functions, then and catch. Then and catch. Now, for example, let's take one scenario. Let's assume that you created one login form. You have here one text box. You have here one password box and you have one button called login. Okay, let's assume that whenever user will enter the credentials here, whenever user is going to enter credentials, like he will enter username, he will enter password, he will click on this button, login. Now, as a client developer, what you have to do? You have to send one request to a server. With this request, you have to send this both the data. You have to send username and password what user have entered. Now there will be a server side application. What the server side people will do? They will access your request. From request, they will access this username and this password. They will connect with the database. And in their database, they will first check, is there any user registered with these credentials? If yes, then they will see what are the data present related to that user. They will send that data as a response. Now that data you will receive as a response. Nothing but server will send that data as a response to the client. Now client will receive that data in the promise object. Now client will handle that promise object. He will use this then and catch. If then gets executed, it means inside this promise object, we have the data which we were expecting. It means we have the success data. So inside that then function, inside that then callback function, we will write some logic so that user will navigate from home page to from login page to the home page. Inside that then callback function, we will write some logic in such a way that user will get navigated from login page to the home page if credentials are right. This is the scenario 1. In scenario 2, let's assume that user entered wrong password and he clicked login button. One request will go. With the request, we will send username and password. Server will receive that username and password. They will connect with the database. They will do the verification. Now, this server will come to know that password is wrong. In that case, server will send one response. In that response, he will not send all the user's information. He will send one error message, like there is some mistake in the password or password is incorrect. Some response they will send. Now, as a client, again, we will receive one promise object. And this time in this promise object, there will be the error data. Now, whenever there is the error data, catch block will execute. Nothing but catch callback function will be called. Now, in that callback function, we will write some logic in such a way that here we will show some alert message. Here we will show some alert message to the user, like username or password is wrong, or we will show one alert block, or we will show some alert dialog box that please enter proper password. So to show that alert message or to navigate to the home page, we have to write some code. So that code we are going to implement here. So to navigate to the home page, whatever code we are going to write, that we will write here inside this callback function. To show that error message or to show that dialog box, to ask user to enter proper password, that logic we will write inside this callback function. So this is why promise object is very important, because as a client, we don't know what we will receive, whether we are receiving success or error data. So we have to ready with both the situations. If we get success data, what we need to do? If you get failure data, what you need to do? So in tomorrow's session, I will explain you guys about the fetch function. And we will see how this fetch function is going to return one promise object. And we will see how that promise object we can handle, how to handle that promise object. So you will get one use case related to this promise object. Then you will get a clear-cut idea how in real time you will face the promise object. So each and every day, you will, as a front-end developer, you will encounter with promise object. There will be no day in your life where you are not working with promise object if you are a front-end developer. That is the reason this promise concept is widely asked in your interviews. It means you are giving JavaScript interview means there is 100% question on the promise object. If you are working with React and Angular, if you are giving the interviews of Angular or React or Vue.js or Node.js, 100% they will ask about the promise object. 100%. Because each and every day you are going to encounter with the promise object. So they wanted to know whether you know promise or not, whether you know about promise object or not, whether you know how to handle it or not. They are going to test you guys. That is the only reason why this promise object is very, very important. Okay. So remaining things we will see in tomorrow's session. So tomorrow I will explain you about the fetch function. And we will see how we can encounter this promise object, how promise object comes into picture. That you will understand with one example. So in today's session, I just made you to understand what is promise object, how to create promise object, how to handle promise object. This is what we tried to understand. In tomorrow's session, we will see one practical example. I will update the notes, guys. Okay. I think I forgot to update. I will push the notes now itself, like within 5-10 minutes. You should be able to find all the notes. You can say class is a blueprint, or you can say class is a collection of properties and methods. And there are two types of constructor, normal constructor, parameterized constructor.